Hello and welcome to TBTV. My name is Elliot Mully Goodbarn. Today I have with me Marc Rogers, who is Vice President of Cybersecurity at Okta. Hello, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for having me.
Good stuff. And today we are going to be talking about the wide-ranging world of cybersecurity. So first of all, let's start off with a nice easy question. Who are Okta, and a little bit about yourself, Marc, as well.
So Okta is a cybersecurity company that helps manage identity and services for companies to make it easy for them to secure authentication, to manage customer identity, employee identity as reliably and as securely as possible.
Fantastic. And where do you sort of fit in at Okta, and how did you get to where you are today, I suppose?
So that's kind of an interesting question. My job in Okta is looking at threats as they're emerging, looking at how I can improve Okta's security position, looking at how I can show people the value that Okta can bring in terms of adding security. And also my passion, breaking as many things as possible and finding out ways to fix them. And as for my background, I'm a hacker at heart. I'm a white hat hacker today, which means I hack ethically. So I break things for good. I don't break things for bad. And I break things with fixing them in mind. So if I find a vulnerability, I also look for how that vulnerability can be addressed. And then I work with the company that owns the product and guide them towards producing a more secure version.
And with that in mind, I mean, we were talking a little bit before about your latest project with mobile phones. I mean, maybe that's a sort of prime example of what you sort of do in a day-to-day sort of business.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I passionately believe anything man makes, man can break. I spent close to a decade working for Vodafone, so I have a passion for mobile phones. You probably saw the stack of phones that I had brought into the studio. And I do a number of different projects. In fact, I usually have half a dozen projects on the go at any one time. But in this case, I'm looking at mobile phones and I'm looking at mobile phone infrastructure to find these backdoors that everybody's talking about. Because while I know there are backdoors out there, most of the rhetoric you hear is talking about backdoors that might exist. I haven't seen much in the way of tangible technical evidence that says, this backdoor is here, this is a problem. So I'm going to go looking through these platforms. I'm going to smash all of those lovely phones that I've got, pull the chips out and see what I can find.
Fantastic. And are you anticipating finding anything at all?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, we know there are backdoors. I mean, governments have been working towards providing this kind of access, but it's not just governments. We know that the operators themselves put in remote control software that allows them to configure phones. The question is, have they done that in a secure way, or have they done it in a way that means you, as a user of the phone, is now vulnerable to a malicious hacker identifying this admin tool and then using it to take over your phone?
Sounds good. So with that in mind, and as we take a broader look of the cybersecurity landscape, I mean, how do you assess that landscape as it is? I mean, we were talking earlier about how 6 months ago it seemed like there was an education piece that could potentially be happening, and now there isn't a week that goes by where I personally get a press release with a threat report in it. So I mean, how do you see cybersecurity and its perception in the market?
So I think the biggest challenge is that there is just too much going on. I mean, there isn't a day that doesn't go past without some kind of breach. And I think the public at large are suffering from breach fatigue. When you heard about a major company being breached a few years ago, it was a big deal. Now it's, another company got popped. And that's hard because it makes it very difficult to teach people about what they need to do, because if it's going on all the time, people will think, why bother? But the reality is, a lot of cybersecurity can be solved with some very simple rules and practices. If people keep good security hygiene personally, and if enterprises keep good security hygiene on their side, you will solve like a good 50 or 60% of the problems that are out there.
And is that what you think that GDPR was that the sort of aim maybe to just try and get some kind of solid standard practices in especially in the enterprise, in the workplace, rather than in personal lives?
Yeah, I mean, GDPR, I think, had a number of different goals. The two most important for me are, one, it's legislation with teeth. And we've needed legislation with teeth for a long time. Companies can't keep on making the same mistakes, same silly mistakes, without repercussions. Repercussions make people do better. And so GDPR is a great step in that direction. The other thing is, companies really don't understand what data they're sitting on. They don't understand the value and the harm that data represents. And they needed something that would force them to look at this through a lens and realize this is what I'm sitting on. How many times have we heard X company has been breached because someone discovered a database sitting out on the internet loaded with data that then got compromised, or an Amazon S3 bucket that had been configured to be wide open and someone had gone in and taken it? If companies kept a closer eye on their data, those things would be much less likely to happen. And GDPR forced people to take that look and to understand. And from that sense, it was a godsend.
So, and then just to cycle back to legislation with teeth, you mean the potential fines and like as I say, reporting on it. That was the headline. That was always the headline. You know, what was it, 4% of revenue or a few million, whatever was higher. So, I mean, that seems quite a stretch, or like that quite seems like a big step to take to go from. I think the maximum was 500,000 before, to go to like a few million or a certain percentage of your revenues. I mean, how do you assess that? Is that a bit of a, for want of a better term, scaremongering maybe, or is it just trying to frighten people into compliance almost?
No, I think it's putting penalties in place that companies will understand and that companies will react to. Consider this: you've got a few £1,000 fine for a major breach for a financial institution. What does a few £1,000s mean to a financial institution? It's what, maybe a quarter of a second of processing of their stuff? That's not a punishment, right? That's a blink. What they need are sanctions. Financial sanctions are good. Other sanctions in terms of controlling how they do business, who they can do business, are also good. But they need things that will hurt. Unless you do something that makes companies sit up and pay attention, they're not incentivized to do something to solve the problem.
And do you think that kind of incentive has changed people's attitudes to, say, their data management strategy in regards to sort of recognising, as you say, the value that they potentially hold, whilst also making sure that is protected?
Yeah, and I think it's early days, so there's still a long way to go. And GDPR is a European piece of legislation, and one of the biggest challenges with cybersecurity is global cybersecurity legislation does not join up. There are different pieces of legislation, different countries all over the world. So somehow we have to bring it together. But just from the GDPR perspective, I've taken several companies through GDPR, and I can tell you that process was A, painful, but B, enlightening. It forced us to look at the data that we had. It forced us to consider what the risks were and what we needed to do it. And it forced us to clean up our act. So in that sense, it's good, and it did good. We just need to work out how to take it further and how to join it with the rest of the world.
And would you say that it was potentially more of the shift that needed to happen within companies, or potentially still needs to happen, is less a technological one and more of a cultural one? I mean, we're seeing a little bit in the market now the danger of phishing attacks, and the fact that employees just through no fault of their own, at least on the face of it, they're not aware of the types of emails and links that they could potentially be clicking. Is it more about culture with a background of that solid sort of technological stance?
There's an old adage: people, processes, and technology. And to solve this, we are literally looking at people, processes, and technology. You can't solve this just by focusing on one thing. So let's say we do a great education campaign and we focus on all of our employees and tell them, you don't click on this, you don't do this. The reality is you are still going to see things coming through. Phishing emails are getting incredibly sophisticated. The old days of badly spelled emails that come through with grammar that looks like it was written by a 5-year-old, they're long gone. There are now toolkits out there that allow you to steal the branding, the language, the tone, everything from a company to make an email that honestly, even someone like me has to take several looks at it to realize that it's fake. So we know those are going to get through. So how do you stop that? Well, that's where you need to have the right processes in place so that if someone does something wrong, they know how to handle it, how to report it. You need to make sure people aren't punished for these things, that instead they're encouraged to bring it forward so you know about it. And then the final thing is technology. I don't want to toot my company's horn too much, but strong authentication and strong identity and assurance of identity are ways to protect this. If instead of just having a simple username and password that you type into a phishing email or gets stolen, you're forced to do something that then triggers a multi-factor authentication or some kind of identity verification, then those phishing emails are going to struggle to work because you can't simply collect a piece of credential and gain access.
Yeah, and just talking about this just reminded me that this morning I got a message from a mother saying, I've had an email saying that you owe Netflix like £100 and something sort of thing. Like it was the Netflix account is through my email sort of thing. I was just like, no, that's spam sort of. But I suppose it's that kind of awareness that instead of replying straight away with bank details and stuff like that, not that that the average person would necessarily do that. It's just sort of thinking twice maybe, and then just being like, hang on, this might not be all that it seems.
I mean, to the people out there who've clicked on these emails, and my own parents have been owned way more times than I'd like to admit. It happens. Google and Facebook lost tens of millions of dollars because of fraudulent financial emails that were sent in that exploited flaws in their processes. So if people if companies like Google and Facebook can fall victim to this, there's no shame for victim to it. We just need to make sure we build the right processes and the right pieces of technology to stop these things from being viable. The depressing thing is, these kinds of simple attacks actually make up the vast majority of attacks on the internet.
And you mentioned sort of cybersecurity policy in general. I mean, we were talking earlier about is it bug bounty, and the idea of effectively outsourcing the threat detection or the vulnerabilities in a cybersecurity policy. I mean, I don't know whether I've done it justice there. So could you just give us a little bit of an explanation?
So one of the hardest challenges that any CISO has to face is you've got this giant corpus of technology, and bugs are literally a matter of fact. You will find bugs in software, you will find bugs in hardware. And so the CISO has to work out how to prioritize it. They also have to be able to find them. At a high-end enterprise, that would be hiring a penetration tester to come in and look for it, or a security consultant to look for it, or have your own dedicated security team. But for smaller companies, that's not so viable. And even with the bigger companies, that's still a finite amount of resource looking for it. The idea behind a bug bounty is you crowdsource it. You invite thousands of people to come and look at your software, to look at your website, find the vulnerabilities, report the vulnerabilities to an intermediary, and then the intermediary helps broker a bounty or reward for finding that bug. And there's defined price lists on these intermediary sites, and you get paid for finding the bugs. Now, that is good, and it does improve things. But there is a big challenge that's becoming more and more apparent, and that is, if you have thousands of people, even just hundreds of people, finding bugs on your platform, where do they go? Because they're not going to fix them. These intermediary companies are not going to fix them. The only people who can fix them are the people who own the software or own the platform. So you're just creating a giant pipeline. And if you don't have the maturity of processes at the other end to receive the bugs and fix them, you're potentially making your situation worse. So the TLDR is, bug bounties are good, but you have to make sure that you have the right back end, the right processes, and the right understanding on how to fix the bugs to really take advantage of them.
I mean, definitely on the face of it, it seems like a bit of a risky move, sort of just inviting people in to effectively have a go at cracking your company. So, I mean, presumably there are processes in place, but as you say, you don't know where they go. You don't know, who they're potentially passing off certain information to. So, I mean, how effective is it for? I mean, is it effective for certain levels of businesses? So, talking about sort of SMEs and to enterprise to larger corporates. As you say, is there a budget that realistically you're going to have to need to roll this out effectively?
Yeah, and so there are several aspects to this. Like, one, you absolutely have to have a pot of cash, because for every bug that someone finds, you're going to have to pay it out. And you run out of money, you're not going to be able to pay them. The other challenge is you have to shore up your own internal processes. If you're not, if your software development lifecycle is weak and you're not finding the low-hanging fruit, you're not closing off the bugs that you should easily be able to find either through automated processes or just through good programmatic hygiene, you're going to be paying out money for things that you shouldn't be paying out money for, and your budget's going to blow straight away. So it's important to make sure that you get rid of the low-hanging fruit so that the things that people are looking for are the more serious things that you didn't find. Now, in terms of the risk, actually, bug bounties, if they're done well, are lower risk, because the reality is the bad guys are still trying to break into your platform. Whether or not there's a bug bounty, there are people trying to break in. What a bug bounty does is it puts constraints around it. It says, you're allowed to go after these assets. You're not allowed to go after these assets. These are the rules you're supposed to follow. You're not allowed to launch denial of service attacks. You're not allowed to do destructive attacks. You're not allowed to steal personal information if you gain access to stuff. So anyone who wants a payout has to follow the rules, and that makes it safer. The bad guys, on the other hand, they don't care. They're just going to go in and do whatever they do. So the more people channeled to doing this responsibly, the better.
I suppose is it the idea of trying to get the, as you say, sort of bad guys on the side effectively? It's trying to use these hackers that are out there to your advantage as much as possible.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, at the end of the day, what are the bad guys doing this for? In most cases, they're doing it for money. And actually, the vast majority of hackers out there, if they're given an opportunity to find a bug, submit a bug, and collect money and do it ethically and gain kudos for it and be known for someone who's doing responsible hacking, quite a significant amount of them would prefer to go down that route than the slightly shadier route of, okay, you find a bug in this platform. Well, now you've got two choices. You either break into the platform and do something which may or may not pay off at all, or you sell it to a shady bug broker who may want to use it or sell it to a government or whatever. But these are illegal things. And if you get caught, you're going to be in trouble. Whereas if you go down the path of ethically hacking, finding bugs, and selling them to these intermediary companies for good, you're operating on the right side of the law.
And when it comes to these hackers, I mean, you yourself used to be a hacker, now a white hacker, as you said before. So, I mean, what's potentially changed? I mean, this concept of ethically hacking didn't, I may well be wrong, and please correct me if I am, but it didn't seem to be around, 5 or 6 years ago. Is it a relatively new concept?
It is relatively new. I mean, I started my first forays into hacking were in the late 80s. I was pretty serious about it in the 90s, but it wasn't until the end of the 90s, early 2000s, that there was any actual money in it. Most of the hacking we did was exploratory. We wanted to see what we could do with systems. Some of the older hackers, such as myself, believe in the original definition of a hacker was defined by by MIT. There was a Model Railway Club. They defined a hack as any modification of a system that changes the function of that system or allows you to perform something that you want to do with that system without destroying its original function or destroying the system itself. And so that's kind of the ethical code that the original hackers followed, was we would go into systems and explore them, but we would do no harm. And then that sort of morphed, and people started being a little bit more aggressive about it. There was a term that came out back then of a cracker. A cracker was someone who just broke into computer systems and didn't necessarily care. But again, there wasn't much money in it around then. It wasn't until much later on that the InfoSec industry blossomed and people started to see money for it, and you got people who were almost mercenaries looking to raise money and change it. And it's continuing to morph. The advent of bug bounties and ethical hacking is another change, and it's a change for good. If you look at the white hat hackers out there and the stuff they're doing, there are groups like I Am the Cavalry. There are white hacking groups who work on things like biomedical devices. I myself have been working on automotive for a while. I hacked the Tesla Model S. I've been working on hacking a number of other vehicles. I know of people who are doing hacking in the aerospace industry. And in all those cases, these are people who are doing it to improve security. So the more we move in that direction, the better for everyone.
And it's interesting that you say that there wasn't very much money in it until approaching the 2000s. So I mean, was that why do you think that was? Was it just because we didn't realise the value in the data that was potentially accessible, or was it something else that meant that it wasn't a viable career, for want of a better term?
So if you go back to, say, the early 90s and you take a look at a vulnerability for a Sun server that allowed you to get control, what could you do with it? You could break into the server, but where's the market? Who would buy it? Right? Governments hadn't at that point really realized the value for these things. I mean, they were starting to, but they hadn't. There were a few isolated cases back in the past where hackers were using their skills, but there it was more about information. Like, for example, in the 80s, there was a German hacker group affiliated with the CCC who were breaking into US universities and stealing information about nuclear projects and selling it to the KGB. It wasn't about vulnerabilities. It was about the information that they were selling. Right. And unfortunately, a couple of them met a rather messy end. It wasn't until later on that governments realized that they could weaponize this stuff. And you had things like NSA building their tailored access unit, and you had other governments building dedicated teams to do it. And at that point, bugs became valuable, and there was a price for it. And also around that time, companies realized that having good security was more than just a simple PR thing. You know, just being PR actually added some money to it, but the fact that it could be so damaging started to drive that price up. And you saw companies appear like At Stake. And as those companies were born, there became more value for bugs, more value for cybersecurity expertise, and essentially the InfoSec industry was born. And from that, we ended up with much more financially motivated cybersecurity.
And just in terms of sort of the difference between hackers, sort of like then and now, is it? I mean, could you point to 5 areas that the hacker has changed, or their tactics have changed over the past decade? So,
I would say it's probably less than 5. I would say it actually boils down to there are those of us that hack because we have a passion, and that passion may have several different directions. For me, I'm passionate about breaking things, but I'm equally passionate about getting them fixed. I really love to see the whole cycle. Like, for example, when I hacked the Tesla Model S, it took me a number of years to disclose the vulnerabilities, work with Tesla, get the patches. And so when we announced the vulnerabilities, they were already fixed. For me, that was a huge win. That was phenomenal. There are other hackers who just break into stuff out of curiosity. They want to see what's in there. I mean, you've probably seen the tagline on certain films. Their only crime was curiosity. But it's actually true. Like, there are people who break into stuff for just pure interest, like the original phone phreaks realized that the telephone network is actually just a giant computer network. And if you can break into it and you can modify it, you can route calls all over the world, you can listen into things, all kinds of cool stuff. So that's one category of hackers. Then the other category of hackers is the people who are into it for money. And they tend to look for things that will get them the quickest return as fast as possible. And honestly, with the exception of the more advanced guys who are doing things like building zero-day vulnerabilities, who are a very small minority, the vast majority of them are doing simple stuff like pumping out phishing emails or writing crimeware kits that can be used to infect browsers or infect systems so they can make money.
And as we look sort of broader for businesses and looking for B2B resellers, I mean, what's the sort of advice, and what's the what kind of solution are we should a business be adopting, or should resellers be recommending to businesses? I mean, is there just one solution, or does it matter about what business you are, aside from any regulation that they may have to adhere to?
So I'd say it's kind of a how long is a piece of string sort of question. Every company has its own threat model. Every company has its own challenges, both financial, personnel, etc. But there are some truisms. Like, one truism is, if you look at the corpus of knowledge about cybersecurity, about 70 to 80% of it applies to everything. Whether you're building an IoT device, whether you're building a car, whether you're building a computer system, whether you're building a telephone network, big chunk of that knowledge applies to you. If you use some of those basic recommendations, and they're not really that complicated, if you're building a computer system, use the online published hardening information about how to do it. And if you can't, hire someone who can do it. If you follow those simple hygiene requirements, you'll rule out most of the basic hacks that people come in. The next layer up tends to be stuff that's more specific because, sure, big chunk of it is about generic security, and then the next level is about specific security. IoT has some very specific things that you need to consider to make it secure. A car has some specific things you need to consider to make it secure. But that doesn't mean just because you don't know what to do with that small bit, like say just because there isn't a standard that matches the thing you're building, that doesn't mean you should say, well, that means I can't do security. No, you should go after the bit that you can do, the easy bit, get that hygiene done, and then build in the rest of the security as and when you can. And you'd be surprised at how well you can design security if you follow a model like that. Security doesn't have to be hard. In fact, one of the biggest problems I think with cybersecurity is a lot of people overcomplicate it. And they think that they have to put in all this extra effort and hire all these extra people. It's not true. A small company can do really well by just, say, appointing a person to say who may have another task, like, say, I don't know, a lead engineer or VP of engineering, and say, you also have the responsibility for security until we expand big enough to hire dedicated people. So long as there is someone who's responsible, who looks at those hygiene things, makes sure that kind of stuff is done, gets information about, oh, we're using X brand of software and a vulnerability has been announced. We need to look at what to do about it. As long as that's going on, you're already ahead of the game. And then as you grow, you can start building a dedicated security resource and scale it appropriately. And the last thing is, don't forget that there are resources out there you can use, like virtual CISOs, like virtual security operation centers, like managed security companies. All of these things can be leveraged to provide an excellent level of security. And the final thing I'll say is the cloud has been a godsend for security. Because if you're a startup, in the old days, you would build a bunch of servers and maybe host it in a kind of co-location place. You would be responsible for the security. And if it went wrong, your stuff would get hacked, all the problems. If you go somewhere like Amazon, if you go to Azure, you go to GCP, what happens is you build your stuff inside an environment where another giant company is responsible for ensuring good security hygiene. Leverage it. Use their knowledge, their development, their skills to do as much of your security as possible. And then you only have to focus on this little extra bit to put the finishing touches on it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. Before we do end, I would like to ask you a couple of questions about your consultancy work, especially with regards to the Amazon TV show Mr. Robot. I mean, that's quite a catastrophic and maybe even depressing sort of look at the way that we address technology and the potentials for a hack. I mean, firstly, how was it sort of working with Amazon and working on that show?
It was very time consuming, but it was fun. There's actually a team of technical consultants who work on the show and advise on all sorts of different aspects to make it as realistic as possible. And I think they've done a phenomenal job in getting that. From my perspective, what I do is whenever we had to come up with some kind of hack that fed into the storyline, I'd build it. And so I would build these hacks at home and play with them. And for example, at the end of season 2, there's a femtocell that's used to hack the FBI. Yes, I built that femtocell. It's sitting in my office at home. And yes, it worked. So it was great fun. I got to build all these things and think about complicated situations. What do you do when someone comes up to you and goes, so for this show, I'd like you to come up with a way to hack a secure FBI office. I haven't thought about that before. Never been given the license to do that before. So from that side, it was great, but it was a little challenging because it was quite time consuming to put all these things together. Mm-hmm. But my end goal for doing that and also for doing the previous show I did, The Real Hustle, was I wanted real hacking on TV. Because I don't know about you, but when I watch shows like CSI Cyber or certain other TV shows with hacking in them, and they portray hacking where someone sits down in front of a screen and they type, and a lot of text scrolls, and then suddenly they've hacked the Gibson and they're in. I throw things at the TV. It just drives me crazy. Because I wanted something on TV that wouldn't make me mad.
Fantastic. And just in terms of the concept behind the show, the idea that without giving away spoilers, that we're getting almost a too connected society, and that could end quite catastrophically. I mean, is that a bit hyperbolized? Is that a real threat? I mean, how do you assess that sort of angle?
I think there's a certain amount of hyperbole there. It would be incredibly difficult and would require a very sophisticated hacking campaign with a lot of people involved to do that kind of damage to an economy. That said, we are consolidating, right? If you consider the number of big companies that you use on a daily basis for your personal information, it's probably actually only 3 or 4. And so you've got 3 or 4 companies that have all of this information in, and if they get hacked, that could be quite bad. And then on another aspect, if you consider things like IoT, well, we are becoming pretty homogenous. You're seeing things like Linux, for example, is the dominant operating system across most IoT. Well, if you found a bug that was common to all of those Linux devices, can you imagine the damage that billions of IoT devices, all suddenly weaponized, could do? We got a taste of that with the Mirai botnet, and that was only a few 100,000 IoT devices. So yeah, I do think we are heading towards an area where there could be problems. Now, thankfully, there are people thinking about this. There are people looking at how they can improve the security, and there are people actively working on countermeasures. So it's a race. We'll see.
Well, on that enlightening subject, we'll have to end it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much for your time, Mark. It's been a pleasure to have a sit down with you and have a chat about cybersecurity. And if you would like to find out more about cybersecurity or anything within the IT Reseller channel, look for Technology Business Today on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook, or go to www.technologybusinesstoday.com. Thank you very much for watching.